While everyone was debating price charts and waiting on Elon to tweet something, the International Monetary Fund, the institution that literally governs how the world's central banks talk to each other, quietly published a document that describes a global financial problem so severe, so structurally dangerous, that they dedicated an entire policy framework to solving it. And here's the brutal part. They described the problem in perfect detail. They mapped the risks. They outlined the architecture of the new financial system. And then, right at the moment where any informed analyst would point to the obvious solution, they stopped. They described the disease. They forgot to name the cure. That cure has a name. It has a ledger. It settles in 3 seconds, and you already hold it. Let me show you exactly what the IMF got right, what they got wrong, and why that gap between those two things is the most important signal in the XRP thesis right now. Welcome back to Ledger.Wealth.Network. I am not here to hype you. I am not here to give you a price target with a date on it. What I am here to do every single time is give you the structural analysis that the mainstream financial press does not have the context to deliver. Today we go deep on the IMF's tokenization framework. No noise, all signal. Let's get into it. Let's start with the hard truth. Most people who hold XRP cannot explain, in plain English, why the asset exists. They know it's fast, they know it's cheap, they've heard Ripple is partnered with banks, but they can't explain the fundamental structural problem that XRP was engineered to solve. So let me give you that foundation right now, because without it, you cannot understand why this IMF document is the most important external validation of the XRP thesis in years. Here's the problem. Global cross-border payments move approximately $150 trillion every single year. That's not a typo, $150 trillion. And the dominant infrastructure carrying that volume, the correspondent banking system, was designed in the 1970s. It runs on batch settlement, 48-hour delays, and a web of bilateral agreements between banks that hold pre-funded accounts for each other. These are called Nostro and Vostro accounts. And right now, $27 trillion in capital, dead, frozen, non-productive capital, is sitting in those accounts around the world, just waiting so that banks can settle payments with each other. $27 trillion, locked, doing nothing, because the infrastructure requires it. Now enter tokenization. What the IMF is describing in their framework is the complete architectural rebuild of that system. Instead of bilateral pre-funding between every bank and every currency pair, you get programmable digital assets settling on shared ledgers instantly, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year. No batches, no delays, no frozen capital sitting idle. The IMF confirms this is not a future state. It is happening now. They write that tokenization creates programmable digital tokens on shared ledgers, enabling instant atomic settlement, 24/7 markets, and automated execution. Trust shifts from intermediaries to code. Settlement shifts from slow and batch-based to instant and continuous. This is the foundation, not a blockchain project trying to disrupt banks. A fundamental restructuring of how value moves across borders, being validated by the most powerful financial institution on earth. And sitting at the center of that restructuring, designed specifically for this moment, is XRP. But here's where it gets even more interesting, because the IMF also maps the exact risks of this new system. And those risks expose a problem that the entire tokenized financial world has not yet solved publicly. But Ripple already has. Let's do the math the retail crowd isn't running. The IMF identifies what they call liquidity fragmentation as one of the central systemic risks of a tokenized world. Here's what that means in plain English. As more currencies become tokenized, as stablecoins multiply across dozens of chains, you end up with hundreds of isolated liquidity pools that cannot talk to each other efficiently. The IMF's proposed solution is what they call synthetic CBDCs, stablecoins backed by central bank reserves, with central banks providing liquidity support for each currency pair. Now run the math on that proposal. If you have 20 major central banks participating in this system, and the IMF is thinking far bigger than 20, you need bilateral liquidity agreements for every possible currency pair. That's what mathematicians call n-squared scaling. 20 banks equals 190 bilateral agreements. 50 banks equals 1,225 bilateral agreements. 100 banks equals 4,150 bilateral agreements. Ask yourself this. In a world of fractured geopolitics, declining bilateral trust, and rising economic nationalism, do you genuinely believe that 100 central banks are going to sit down and hammer out 4,150 separate liquidity agreements? The answer is no. And this is the flaw the IMF built into their own framework without acknowledging it. Now compare that to the bridge asset model. You don't need bilateral agreements. You don't need pre-funded liquidity pools between every currency pair. Every currency converts to the bridge asset. The bridge asset converts to the destination currency. One asset, one ledger, every pair, every corridor, every currency, solved. The math isn't complicated. The cost of using XRP to bridge a $1 million cross-border payment is fractions of a penny in transaction fees and seconds in settlement time. The same transaction through the correspondent banking system costs hundreds of dollars in fees and takes up to 2 days. And here's the number that should stop you cold. Daily foreign exchange volume globally is $7.5 trillion per day. If XRP captures even 0.5% of that daily flow as a bridge asset, the demand implications for a fixed supply of 100 billion tokens, with roughly 55 billion in active circulation, is not a prediction. It is a mathematical requirement. The math doesn't lie. The system was built for this. While retail investors are fixated on the daily candle, the institutional architects of the next financial system are moving with quiet, deliberate certainty. Consider what has happened in just the last 90 days. Tokenized real-world assets on the XRP ledger have gone from $1 billion on January 1st to over $2 billion by the end of March. That's a doubling in a single quarter. Over the full course of 2025, tokenized asset volume on the ledger is up over 2,200%. That's not a price spike driven by retail emotion. That is live, institutional capital being deployed onto the ledger in the form of U.S. treasuries, tokenized funds, and stablecoins. BlackRock, the largest asset manager on Earth with over $10 trillion under management, is hiring a managing director of digital assets. The job description covers crypto strategy, stablecoin integration, and tokenization execution. Compensation ranges from $270,000 to $350,000 base before bonuses. This is not a pilot program. This is a dedicated team being built to execute at scale. Securitize, backed by BlackRock and Morgan Stanley, just signed a memorandum of understanding with the New York Stock Exchange to develop tokenized securities markets. Securitize has stated directly that they work with Ripple to ensure tokenized assets integrate with RLUSD for on-chain liquidity. Ripple has been an investor in Securitize since 2019. These relationships are not new. They are now becoming operational. RLUSD, Ripple's regulated stablecoin, sits at $1.56 billion in market cap. It is being used as collateral in BlackRock's BuIdle tokenized fund through the Securitize infrastructure. It is being piloted in Singapore's Mass Bloom sandbox for trade finance settlement. It was proposed for Federal Reserve account integration in congressional testimony. And Ripple itself has 300 banking partners across 45 countries on its payment network right now. Not in a pitch deck, operational. Smart money does not accumulate before certainty. Smart money builds the certainty and then executes. What you are watching is not preparation. It's the early stages of deployment. The question is not whether you believe in XRP. The question is whether you are positioned before the rest of the market figures out what the institutions already know. Now let me give you the specific catalysts that matter in the window ahead. The Digital Asset Clarity Act is the legislative key turning institutional positioning into institutional deployment. What that bill does is establish clear legal classification for digital assets, separating commodities from securities, establishing which regulator has jurisdiction, and removing the legal ambiguity that has kept major institutional balance sheet exposure off the table. The SEC has already classified XRP as a commodity in the context of the Ripple lawsuit resolution. The Clarity Act codifies that designation at the federal level. Once that happens, the compliance gatekeepers at every major bank, hedge fund, and asset manager, the people who have been holding up internal approval for XRP exposure, have no more legal gray area to point to. NASDAQ has publicly targeted Q3 2026 for the rollout of tokenized stock products. The DTCC, the clearing backbone of the U.S. financial system, has an active 3-year tokenization pilot, and Ripple Prime is listed in their participant directory. These are not press releases. These are infrastructure projects with timelines. The window between now and that legislative clarity, and between now and mainstream tokenized asset deployment, is the window where patient positioning still matters. Once the Clarity Act passes and NASDAQ launches tokenized equities, the conversation shifts from, will this happen, to, how did I miss it? The fuse is already lit. Let me bring this back to the asset itself, because structure without supply mechanics is an incomplete thesis. XRP has a fixed supply of 100 billion tokens. That number will never change. Approximately 55 to 57 billion are in active circulation. Ripple releases 1 billion tokens per month from escrow, and the overwhelming majority of those tokens are relocked, not entering the market. Now think about what happens to that supply as the on-demand liquidity corridors scale. As more payment corridors use XRP as the bridge asset, more XRP needs to be held in liquidity pools simultaneously to facilitate settlement. That capital doesn't disappear. It gets locked in ODL infrastructure, effectively removed from the liquid float in a structural, demand-driven way. Here's the brutal question you should be asking yourself. At what price point does the XRP required to settle $1 trillion in daily cross-border flow become scarce relative to available supply? That is not a Moonboy question. That is a supply and demand question. And the answer, when you run the numbers against the size of the markets XRP is being built to serve, reframes every price conversation you've ever had about this asset. The window where accumulation is still possible before that scarcity becomes widely understood is not permanent. It is closing. Quietly, methodically. Exactly the way the institutions are closing it. Let me pull the through line together, because the thesis is not scattered. It is a single, coherent arc. The IMF just published a document confirming that tokenization is not a future possibility. It is the new structure of global finance. They described the central risk, liquidity fragmentation, with precision. They proposed a solution, synthetic CBDCs, that collapses under its own mathematical weight at scale. And by doing so, they wrote the most compelling policy-level argument for a neutral bridge asset that has ever appeared in a mainstream institutional document. Ripple is building that bridge. RLUSD is the stablecoin layer. The XRP ledger is the settlement infrastructure. XLS80 and XLS81 provide the compliance framework the IMF is asking for. The 300 banking partners provide the network. BlackRock, Securitize, the NYSE, NASDAQ, and the DTCC provide the institutional deployment vector, and the Clarity Act provides the legal foundation that turns all of it from positioning into execution. Every piece is in place. Every institution knows its role. The only variable left is time. In a market fueled by emotion and noise, we thrive on data and composure. Haste leads to loss. Calm analysis leads to victory. If you made it to the end of this video, comment Ledger below. I want to see who is actually paying attention. Stay patient, stay rational. And as we always do, we don't wait for the future. We plan for it. Peace.